The skies over the Baltic Sea, usually a tense but silent patrol corridor, erupted into chaos. A Dutch F-35, which had taken off just hours earlier from Volkel Base in the Netherlands, was slicing through the cold air at 35,000 feet. On a routine surveillance mission, supported by an RQ-4 Global Hawk drone scanning undersea infrastructure. Its stealth design was meant to keep it invisible, but that morning's stealth wasn't enough. 70 miles northwest of Kaliningrad, Russia's heavily armed enclave with missile batteries. The silence was shattered. Deep in a fortified bunker, the massive S-300 radar system lit up powerful arrays, locking onto a single blip. In the tense command room, Russian officers whispered to each other, convinced this was a hostile Ukrainian aircraft daring to encroach on the wrong airspace. The order came swiftly: fire. A 40 N6 surface-to-air missile over 25 feet long and weighing nearly 3,500 kilograms roared off the launcher. In mere seconds, it accelerated to Mach 12 over 9,000 mph, leaving a white scar across the sky as it hunted the drone. Inside the F-35 cockpit, the 32-year-old Dutch pilot's sensors screamed warnings. He yanked the stick hard, deployed decoys, diving into violent, evasive maneuvers, pinning him to his seat with crushing G-forces. For nearly 27 harrowing seconds, death chased him through the thin Baltic air. The missile didn't hit directly, but as it self-destructed just 500 yards from the drone, the shockwave ripped the sky like thunder. Shrapnel completely shredded the drone, and the mild aftershock damaged the F-35's engine, shaking the aircraft. Red warning lights flashed across the pilot's panel. The plane was no longer combat capable. Gasping sweat pouring into his eyes, the pilot steadied his trembling hands. He keyed the secure radio voice, low but steady. "Mayday, Mayday, Eagle 2 drone hit near Baltic. Aircraft compromised. Emergency landing initiated." The plane's nose dipped toward the gray sea below. In a fleeting moment, the pilot glimpsed the flash from the shattered drone, and he knew escape was impossible. The F-35 banked hard and began a desperate plunge toward the water. Beneath the Baltic's calm surface, the stage was set. What Moscow thought was a warning shot had crossed the line. And in Brussels, the flashing message on encrypted screens would soon be read as nothing less than an act of war. The distress signal from the downed drone and affected F-35 reached Brussels. A single encrypted message bounced via satellite carrying chilling words: "Drone hit. Aircraft compromised. Immediate recovery needed." In minutes, the secure conference room inside NATO headquarters, known as the Situation Room, filled with the alliance's most powerful decision-makers. The NATO Secretary-General defense ministers, American, British, and Dutch generals, sat with grim faces as details appeared on screens. The Baltic Sea, one of the world's most contested corridors, had just claimed a $220 million drone and threatened a fighter jet. Worse, intelligence confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The missile was launched from Kaliningrad, home to one of Russia's densest radar networks and anti-air batteries. The odds of it being a mistake were low. The implications were overwhelming. Russia had effectively attacked NATO. The Secretary General gave the single order: prepare the fleet. Across the Atlantic, USS Harry S. Truman, America's most advanced carrier, stood ready with its strike group: 1 carrier, 2 guided missile cruisers, 3 destroyers, and over 70 aircraft. On the Admiral's order, ops officers began calculating flight paths, strike packages, and satellite support. The plan was brutal in its clarity: strike straight at the heart of Kaliningrad's impenetrable defense system. 55 suicide drones equipped with radar jamming pods and guided bombs would lead. Behind them, a wall of steel: 12 Italian and Dutch F-35s, plus 8 Fa-18 Super Hornets, all loaded with precision weapons. From the decks of the USS Harry S. Truman, more than 55 unmanned suicide drones lifted into the air, their wings glinting against the fading sun. Each carried a payload of 150 tons of precision explosives and pods designed to jam Russian radar. They spread out across the sky in wide arcs, forming a swarm that stretched for miles. Behind them came the steel spearhead 12 F-35s from Italian and Dutch squadrons and 8 Fa-18 Super Hornets climbing to strike altitude. Flying in tight V formations, their engines thundered across the Baltic, their holds bristling with GBU-53 smart bombs and AIM-9X missiles. On the carrier deck below, sailors watched silently, knowing that in the next half hour, the world might tilt into open war. Inside Kaliningrad's bunkers, alarms screamed. The Russian operators, overwhelmed by a sudden cascade of false signals, saw their radar screens bloom with hundreds of ghost contacts. The American-led drones flooded the airwaves, blinding the defenders. Yet secondary radars from Tor M2 and Buk M2 batteries began tracking, and the sky above Kaliningrad lit up. The Russians fired first. A salvo of 15 surface-to-air missiles streaked upward, corkscrewing through the haze. In less than 60 seconds, 10 NATO drones were torn apart, exploding into harmless fireballs. One drone spun out of control, veering dangerously close to the F-35s before being vaporized by a quick burst from an escorting F-18. But the swarm pressed on. The surviving 45 drones split into 3 attack groups, diving toward radar arrays and missile launchers. The first impact landed. A drone slammed directly into a Buk M2 battery, detonating with a roar that sent a mushroom of fire rising 150 feet into the air. Secondary explosions followed as fuel trucks and ammunition caches went up in flames. Seizing the opening, the F-35s dropped into attack runs. In pairs, they unleashed precision-guided GBU-53s, each bomb screaming down at Mach 1. The results were catastrophic. One Russian radar dome costing over $250 million vanished in a single strike. Another command bunker reinforced with concrete was cracked open like an eggshell. Still, the defenders fought back. Tor M2 batteries fired volley after volley of autocannon shells, tracers ripping across the clouds. A burst struck the wing of one UAV cluster, sending 2 drones spiraling into the sea. An F-18 swooping low returned fire with a GBU-53 silencing the gun crews in a single flash. By now, the battle was a storm of fire and steel. NATO had lost 12 drones but obliterated at least 6 major air defense positions, leaving gaping holes in Kaliningrad's shield. The F-35s and Super Hornets circled back, their radios alive with clipped, calm voices ready for the second phase of the strike. The world had just witnessed something unthinkable. The supposedly impenetrable fortress of Kaliningrad, Russia's pride, was bleeding under the sky, and the storm had only begun. Before we get into the heart of this war, support us by liking, subscribing, and letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Baltic skies. The NATO assault had torn gaping holes into Kaliningrad's air defenses, but Moscow's fortress was not yet silent. Deep in hardened bunkers, Russian commanders screamed new orders. Surviving S-300V and Tor M2 systems locked onto the NATO strike force, their launch tubes rising like steel fangs. In less than a minute, 18 surface-to-air missiles were fired in rapid succession. White contrails laced the sky, each warhead moving at blistering speeds, some exceeding Mach 10. The swarm of drones scattered, but the F-35s and Super Hornets had no such luxury. A thunderous explosion split the sky. An F-18 Super Hornet valued at over $80 million took a direct hit from an S-300 missile. The aircraft disintegrated mid-air, raining flaming debris across the Baltic waves. Pilots ejected but perished in flames. The radio call crackled across every headset, "Hornet down, Hornet down." Moments later, another missile exploded dangerously close to a circling F-35. Shrapnel ripped through the engine housing, tearing holes in its stealth skin. The pilot fought desperately, warning lights flashing across his console. With smoke trailing behind him, he barely managed to pull away, limping back toward international waters. For a fleeting moment, NATO faced overwhelming firepower, threatening to reverse their gains. The surviving F-35s dove into evasive maneuvers, their stealth profiles saving them from radar lock. But the Super Hornets, heavier and less stealthy, fought under relentless fire. Then came the counterstrike. The USS Arleigh Burke, an American destroyer patrolling 110 mi offshore, received coordinates of the Russian command hub. Within seconds, its vertical launch cells ignited. 15 Harpoon cruise missiles, each carrying a high-explosive warhead, erupted from the sea, arcing into the Baltic skies. The missiles flew low and fast, hugging the contours of the Earth at nearly 600 mph. Russian radars scrambled to respond, but many were already crippled. Missiles struck bunkers and warehouses, killing over 24 officers and igniting chains of explosions that rattled Windows 10 MIA. Away flames rising 250 feet into the air, black smoke curling toward the heavens. Kaliningrad's vaunted command network was collapsing. Nearly half of its senior officers were dead or missing, and communications between air defense units had disintegrated into static. The Russians had thrown everything they had into the counterattack, and still NATO, unified under American might, answered with steel and fire. But victory came at a cost. The alliance had lost one of its newest fighters and 2 brave pilots. For the men aboard the Harry S. Truman, their sacrifice burned as deeply as the flames rising over Kaliningrad. And yet the battle was not finished. The final blow was still to come. What had once been the pride of Russia's western defenses was now nothing but rubble and smoke. Satellite images confirmed the unthinkable. Over 65% of Kaliningrad's entire radar infrastructure was destroyed in under 35 minutes. The losses were catastrophic. Intelligence intercepts later revealed that at least 38 Russian officers were killed, including 2 generals and 7 senior colonels, along with more than 350 soldiers either dead or wounded. Ammunition depots that had taken 8 years to stockpile were incinerated in less than an hour. Damage estimates soared beyond $5.2 billion in equipment, fortifications, and command assets erased. For NATO, the blow was heavy but limited. One fighter lost 2 pilots dead. A painful sacrifice, but in exchange, the entire backbone of Russia's Baltic shield had been shattered. Of the 10 radar sites that once guarded Kaliningrad, only 2 remained functional, operating on emergency power and unable to track stealth aircraft. By evening, Russian radio chatter painted a picture of chaos. Surviving troops were ordered to abandon positions. Convoys of trucks fled inland. Families evacuated coastal villages fearing more strikes. For the first time in decades, Kaliningrad, the fortress Moscow called untouchable, was silent. On the decks of the USS Harry S. Truman, sailors looked east at the towering plumes of smoke. The cost had been blood, but the outcome was undeniable. NATO had not only avenged its downed assets, it had erased an entire stronghold. In just under an hour, a single missile fired from Kaliningrad had spiraled into a catastrophe for Moscow. NATO had answered with 55 drones, 20 fighters, and 15 Harpoon missiles. And the result was absolute. Over 300 Russian casualties, billions in destroyed infrastructure, and a fortress reduced to silence. But the victory was not bloodless. 2 NATO pilots had given their lives that day, their aircraft falling in flames over hostile skies. On the deck of the USS Harry S. Truman, their absence was felt more deeply than any triumph could conceal. Yet their sacrifice carried meaning. It reminded the world that NATO resolve is written not only in steel and fire, but also in the lives of those who defend its flag. Kaliningrad had been considered untouchable. Now it stood as a smoldering warning to allies, proof that NATO would never hesitate when its people were threatened. To adversaries, it was a lesson carved in ruins. Strike at NATO assets and the response will not be measured in words but in annihilation. If this scenario gripped you, support us by liking and subscribing for more. Disclaimer: this content is a work of fiction intended for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real events, places, or people is coincidental. The content does not represent the official views of any organization and does not promote violence, illegal behavior, or discrimination. Viewers should exercise their own judgment and not use this content for purposes other than entertainment.